The Westport Library presents author Michele Leigh speaking about her fantasy novel, Tales of the Deer Witch, on Thursday, June 13th, 2013.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy night. Yes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of how I started writing, talk to you about my play, Always Anastasia, and then the book, Tales of the Deer Witch, and a little bit about the self-publishing process. I did self-publish, and many people want to know what was that like, what are the pros, what are the cons, so I'll talk a little bit about that. So when I was a young girl, I was always fascinated with books and movies and music and theater and any kind of creative expression. I was very drawn to any kind of creative outlet. Some authors who inspired me when I was younger, I never really read young adult. I mean, I read Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I think everybody read that book. But I used to read authors like Anne Rice. I loved old school Anne Rice, The Vampire Chronicles, The Mayfair Witches. I read Patricia Highsmith. Does anybody know that name? She wrote Strangers on a Train and The Talented Mr. Ripley. Some mysteries, murder mysteries and intrigue. And another current author is T.J. McGregor. And she goes by her initials because her publishers told her that to write mysteries and to write this type of book, that it's mostly a male-dominated field, and you don't want people necessarily to know you're a girl. And her name is Trish, but she uses her initials. And what I think is cool about T.J. McGregor is her books are listed in both fantasy and mystery. And I kind of think that for myself to be a crossover artist, that I think of Tales of the Deer Witch is basically a fantasy novel, but some people say it does read like a thriller, and there is some mystery and some intrigue. So those three women really inspired me and helped motivate me as far as writing goes. As Marta mentioned, I did go to Western Connecticut State University, WestCon. I was a non-traditional student. I went to college in my 30s, which I highly recommend. I didn't go to college right after high school, and I think it's a good thing because I don't think you know what you want to do, when you're 20 years old. So in my 30s, I went to school, and I'd already had a job, so I didn't really focus on business or computer science, but I took classes that interested me, and I found myself in creative writing and poetry, and I joined the choir, and I took alternative medicine and Native American studies, and I took all sorts of classes that I think really helped solidify the creative aspect of what I wanted to do. And there were two pivotal moments in college that I think nudged me towards writing, and one of them is in an American Perspectives class. It was a history class, but he taught history through literature. We would read a book in a particular period in time, and then we would write a paper on it if you wanted to know what it was like to live in the 50s. Here's a book that was written in the 50s. And his name was Professor Palinsar. And I remember because I wrote my first paper, and he handed it back to me, and instead of a grade in the upper right-hand corner, he just wrote two words. He wrote, "See me." And I was like, oh, no. I thought for sure, I had been found out, and he knew that I was a non-traditional student, and I didn't know how to write a paper. And I went up to see him, and he said, I wanted to meet the person that wrote this paper. He said, you can write. He's like, you write very well. He goes, but I feel like you're holding back a little bit. I feel like you're giving me what I want to hear, and you're worried about being politically correct. And I want to see a little more Michele in your papers. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if you're ready for that, Professor Palinsar. But I was like, okay. And he said, it's an opinion paper. It's your opinion. It can't be wrong. Just go ahead and write it. Because when I used to write, and especially essays and papers in school, if I were to write a joke or something that I thought was funny or some kind of analogy, I would be like, delete, thinking I can't put that in my papers. But he sort of opened me up to the idea that, no, it's okay to do that. And so I started writing, and especially I think in college, I did learn and hone the craft of, that's how you use a semicolon. I did learn those things, but I think mostly I gained confidence because people would say, wow, you do write well, or I would long for an essay question in any of my classes. So Professor Palinsar really helped nudge me in that direction. And another pivotal moment, which was instrumental, I think, was the very last class I had to take. I needed some kind of elective, and I didn't know what I wanted to take. And I needed something that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I was just trying to find something in this little niche. And there was a playwriting class. And I was like, ooh, maybe I'm a playwright. Maybe I'll take this playwriting class. And that was a class with another fabulous professor who wore long pashminas, and she sort of flipped them over her shoulders. And she was like, in this class, you are going to write a play. You're going to write a one-act play in the 16 weeks. You're going to pick a set, you're going to pick your actors, pick your storyline. And she goes, and half of you are going to drop out. And she was absolutely right that, there was about 30 people in class. By the end, there was 15 of us. And I'd say there are about 5 to 10 coherent plays at the end of it, because a lot of people think they want to write, but it's not easy. And what I liked about the one-act play was it was something tangible, because it was small. If I thought I'm going to sit down and write a whole play, that would feel like it's too big. But a one-act play, it's one set and 5 characters or less, and you have to tell your story in 30 minutes. And I was like, oh, I can do this. So my play was Always Anastasia, and it was sort of a murder mystery. It's been described as like a Law and Order, an episode of Law and Order on the stage. Some of my super fans are here tonight, actually saw the play. But I submitted it to the Strawberry Festival, which is like an American Idol for playwrights. It's in New York City, and they perform 4 or 5 plays, and then the audience votes for the best play, moves it to the next round. So I got to experience my words on a stage. I directed the play. The play was then selected for publication in a compilation called The Best Plays from the Strawberry Festival, Volume 5. And again, to just see your words in print. And the best part of being selected for the compilation was to promote the book. We got to do a 3-week run at the Producers Club in New York City, which is off Broadway, but it's in New York City, and it's on a stage, and I not only directed at that time, but I played one of the parts. So it's about a cop, a disillusioned cop, and his partner, and then his wife disappears, and so the wife only appears in flashbacks. And when I think back to this, too, I only put 3 characters in my play, and the 3 characters were never all on the stage at the same time, because I was a little intimidated about 3 people on the stage and figuring out what they were saying and doing, and so it was only 2 people at a time. But when we did the 3-week run, I played the cop's partner. So again, that was just exhilarating, and again, all of this was just confidence building to say, oh, okay, people do like the play, and you can kind of write. So it was right after the Strawberry Festival that I was embarking on my 40th birthday, and my husband said, what do you want? Do you want a party, or do you want a fabulous vacation? And I said, I want a fabulous vacation. And he said, okay, I'm on it. And he just surprised me. He didn't tell me where we were going or what we were doing. And I would ask him, should I bring my passport? And he was like, you should always bring your passport when you travel. He wouldn't tell me exactly where we were going. And he took me to a place off the Florida Keys. It's called Little Palm Island. And it is well-renowned for privacy. And there's these little bungalows. And we never saw any of the other guests. And we hardly ever saw any staff. But what we did see on the island were these deer, these key deer that swam from island to island. And it was one night we were sitting on the beach and we saw them coming out of the ocean and we were like, what is that? And these deer were so beautiful. I think because they were swimming in the salt water, their coats were just beautiful and their faces had this human-like expression. And my imagination just sort of went wild with that. I mean, they didn't morph into the shape of a witch, but I was like, oh, look at these deer, and I wonder what they're doing here, and what do they do during the day, and what do they do when we're all sleeping? And I started sort of like that painting of, what bears do when no one's looking, and the bears are all dancing. I started just going with that. And on that vacation, I read a collection of short stories, and they were all different genres, but one that stood out to me was called The Mournful Cry of the Owl. And it's by Christopher Golden. And again, it was a short story, so I was like, okay, a one-act play, I can write a short story. Again, just thinking I'm going to take little baby steps. But it was a really well-written novel, well, a short story. So it was a well-written story, but about this girl, and she was searching for herself, and it was about transformation and growing up and getting to know yourself. And at the end, spoiler alert, but she just runs through the forest and she sprouts wings and she becomes an owl. And I was like, oh, and it just opened up this idea of it was shocking and it was interesting and it was something that stayed with me. So I thought, let me sort of see, let me jot down some ideas. Let me see what I can do with that. So I, again, started as a short story, and I thought, what about these deer that maybe morph into the shape of a human? Maybe they have supernatural powers. And I created this species of a deer witch. Now, the idea of a shapeshifter is not new. The idea of a shapeshifter has been around for quite a while. A werewolf is a shapeshifter, anything that goes from a human to an animal form. But I liked the idea of a deer, and I said, okay, are they immortal creatures, and do they die, or how do they die, or how are they made, and how are they born? And I had to create this whole idea for it. And it started growing and growing and growing, and it became bigger than a short story. And when I started having chapters that I said, oh, I want to see what these are going to be like, I missed the structure of a playwriting class or of school. I had graduated at this point where you get to read your work in front of people and get feedback. So I did a couple of things. I joined a writing group, which there's lots of writing groups around, and I met these amazing women that met once a month, and you would bring a couple pages, and you'd read them out loud. You'd print out copies, too, and you'd hand them out. So you'd get handwritten notes, and you'd get verbal feedback, and, some good, some bad, some healthy constructive criticism. When you're getting feedback, and I think I'm still learning this, too, you have to listen to what people are saying and not do everything that people are saying. But if one person says to you, this part's really confusing, you might want to take a look at it. But if 10 people tell you this is confusing, then it's confusing, and there's things that you have to sort of be able to adjust to. So the writing group I went to for almost 2 years. So I started writing the book in 2009. I published it in 2012. So the whole process was over 3 years. And 2 of those years I was going to this writing group and really developing it. Now, most of the women in the writing group were writing memoirs and autobiographies, and no one was really writing this fantasy genre. So sometimes it would just be, I don't know what you're doing here, or, this isn't my genre, but I like it and I'm interested. But I wanted to get some feedback from people who wrote fantasy. So I found an online fantasy forum where you can post a chapter and get some feedback and then critique other fantasy writing, which opened up my eyes to what's possible in the fantasy genre. And it's really, you can't imagine, anything goes. I mean, you can really go anywhere with it. So the fantasy forum, and then I did get a group of readers, just friends and families and colleagues, and strangers gave me the best feedback. So sometimes it would be someone I work with whose cousin's husband wanted to read it, and those types of people I would send out chapters and get feedback. So I didn't just sort of sit in a bubble and write it and send it to the printer. I did really work with it and try to develop it and bring it through the writing group and the online forums and the readers. And I also used an application called Speak It. It's $1.99, and you can copy and paste chunks of text into the Speak It, and it reads back to you in an unemotional voice. And there is nothing more humbling than hear, well, that's a really awkward sentence, because when you start reading it yourself, you're adding your own inflection. So doing those types of things. But the day comes when you need an editor. And I do have a whole section of editing, because the book was self-published, and some people think if it's self-published that, again, you just wrote it and sent it to the printer and you didn't have anyone look at it. And the editing process was very challenging for me because you need to find an editor who gets you, who gets your material, who doesn't want to change your story but wants to enhance your story. So I ended up finding an editorial service that works on word count. So by the time I had this book that I thought wasn't perfect but was pretty close to what I wanted to say, I found an editorial service that charged you per word, and they did 3 rounds of editing. So these people were looking at pieces of the book. This editor looked at the whole book, and in Word turned on, track changes and gave me all these comments. I had hundreds of comments throughout the whole book of the characters and the story and what worked and what didn't work, and gave me ideas, and then I could take it back and I could revise it. Sent it for the second round, which was looking for consistency and things like, well, Michele, here you say it's an old antique clawfoot tub, and then later you say it's got jacuzzi jets. So which is it? That sort of thing. Looking for consistency, looking for sentence structure, looking for word choice. Is this a better word? And then I got to revise it and send it back. And then the third round was really looking for typos and looking for the semicolons and the commas. So I really had a lot of different eyes on it before I decided, okay, it's finished. And now when it's finished, the big question is, what do you do with it? And the choice you have is you can send it out to publishing companies. There's about 6 big publishing companies that could really put you in every bookstore and every airport if that's the way you wanted to go. But you could wait years for a rejection letter, and I had already spent over 3 years writing the book. So I really wanted something tangible, and I was drawn to the self-publishing process because of the idea that I could have a book. I could have a hardcover book, a softcover book, an ebook, but I could have something, even if I gave it to my friends for their birthday, it would be something tangible. The creative control, I loved the idea that I would have complete creative control and somebody wasn't going to take this book and try to commercialize it or tell me I had to change this or had to change that I had final cut. I mean, that's attractive to me that I had final cut. It's also scary that I had final cut, but I like the idea of that. Some of the cons of self-publishing is it does get expensive to self-publish. There are certain packages that you purchase, and I'd be happy to answer questions during the Q&A if you guys have specific questions about it. But the company I used was called Author House, and there's lots of companies that do it. Another one I'd say to look into is Create Space, which is directly connected to Amazon. But what a self-publishing company will do for you is they'll get you an ISBN number, they'll copyright it, they'll get you a typeset of your book, so they'll make sure that it's available on Amazon.com and through all online distributors. And they do a print on demand, so they don't just print 1,000 of them and then you put them in your basement. When somebody orders it on Amazon, they actually print it on demand. And then they give you all sorts of marketing materials. You see the bookmarks and little Post-it notes that are all over the place. So they will give you that type of thing. It was through Author House also that I found the editorial service. And through Author House, too, they have like a Twitter feed, and they'll push your book, and they give you a little bit of promotion. But you do have to do your own self-promotion. And I do that through, I have a website, I have a blog, I try to blog regularly. I do have a monthly newsletter that coincides with the full moon. So I do dabble a little bit in astrology as well, and there is some astrology in the book, but when the full moon comes out, I'll give a little blurb of, hey, this month the full moon is in Scorpio and what that might mean, and then, hey, I'm going to be at the Westport Public Library this month. So doing those types of things, it's really like a grassroots mentality. But slowly but surely, I'm starting to get some attention. I was at the New Age Fair, the Book Expo in New York City at the Jacob Javits Center. Book clubs are a great way to promote your book. I just got on a book club for October, so this group is going to read my book, and then I'll come in October and answer their questions. So the pros and cons of self-publishing. The pros would really be the creative control, the tangible product, the final cut. The cons would be that you are responsible for your own self-promotion. It can get expensive, and there is a stigma. There is still a stigma to self-publishing that I did not expect. That in this day and age, I think we're in a wonderful opportunity where everybody who has something to say can say it, and even in music, in something like Pandora, where you can say, I like this artist, and they'll recommend other artists like that. I mean, the same concept with self-publishing. If you buy one book from Stephen King, then you might like this author as well. But when some people hear you're self-published, they associate that with, well, the book isn't done well, or the book is not good. And if it's published at a company, it's good, and if it's self-published, it's bad. And that's not always the case, but there is still a stigma to being self-published. I just said something to someone the other day, and they said, I said, it's self-published. And they went, I get the head self, I'm sorry. Like it was a consolation prize. But I do think that it's something I chose, and I am happy with the self-publishing, but it is this sort of self-promotion that you have to keep going. And I just recently went to a psychic as well, who did tell me that the second book is going to be more popular than the first book, and that there is a third book that's going to be more popular than the second. So writing additional books, and I do feel like this book is a trilogy, that there are 3 books in the whole story arc. So that's sort of what I wanted to say. I do want to read a little piece of the book, and we do want to do a little Q&A, and I don't know what kind of order we want to do. Does anybody have any burning questions, or do you want me to read a little bit from the book first? Read. I'd like you to read, please. Okay, so I'm going to read you a little piece from the beginning of the book. So a little context. The book is about Gwen and Jack, who are workaholics. They live in New York City. They have their own business. It's her 40th birthday. Her husband takes her on a surprise vacation. And I wrote about this in my blog recently, is how much, nonfiction is in that fiction. And usually I think it's about 50-50. So you'll see that I did base some of it on, you write what you know. She's got long curly hair. The character is basically, people do recognize me. But then you add your imagination to the concept of the deer witch. So I'm going to read you in the beginning when we first get to the island, and we are going out to dinner, and we do encounter the deer. So, okay. We step outside just as the sun is about to set. We probably have another hour of daylight and can't figure out if we should bring our sunglasses or not, finally deciding against it. The sky is turning amazing shades of pink and purple, and the night is warm but breezy as we set out in search of the restaurant. My beaded bag swings in a leisurely pattern from my wrist as we walk hand in hand down the sandy path, which appears likely to circle the island, with little offshoot paths leading this way and that. We make a few wrong turns, feeling like mice in a maze, and finally following our noses to the beach. One lone table sits near the water's edge. The table and its 2 chairs are surrounded by tall tiki torches stuck deep into the sand. Waves gently rolling in toward land and then ebbing out provide the only sound on the empty beach. Clumps of sand get caught in my sandals, so I quickly slide them off and carry them. As we get closer, I can make out the folded card on the table with a handwritten Gwen in flamboyant script. Where the hell are all the other guests, I wonder aloud. Maybe there's a later seating. Jack wanders over to the main house, and I follow close behind, still carrying my sandals and shaking off the excess sand. We figure that the large white structure with the wraparound porch serves as the restaurant, but the doors are locked, so we peer through the windows. Even though the place has the feel of a haunted house, everything is polished and clean, free from any dust or cobwebs. Tables are set with fresh linen, fancy silverware, and elaborate flower arrangements. It reminds me of the time we arrived early for a friend's wedding and got to enter the ballroom before everyone else, when everything seemed frozen in eternal perfection. That's when I have my first official vision of the day. I've been so preoccupied with the stress of traveling that I hadn't focused on the low buzzing that seems to be my constant companion these days. Usually, I can manage to block out the walkie-talkie in my head that's turned down but never completely off. Most of it is static anyway, but every now and then it crackles to life abruptly after long periods of dead air, a kind of telepathic transmission of images. The visions are triggered by touch and are usually accompanied by a wave of emotion. I'm still struggling to understand my newfound sensitivity, but I've learned intense feelings like fear, anger, jealousy, or sadness broadcast the loudest. And so it happens that when I touch the metal door handle of the restaurant for one more wiggle, I am struck by a wavy image of a dining room, devoid of people, on board the Titanic. It's like an underwater camera depicting tables elegantly set up for dinner, about to be served at the bottom of the sea. I pull my hand away as if the handle is hot, and Jack snaps his head in my direction. What is it? I shake off the sensation. Nothing. It's just, I had one of those visions. Rolling my eyes as if poking fun at myself, and pausing because I'm not sure how much I want to share, I shrug. Like we were touring a sunken ship. I feel almost apologetic since the accident, offering these descriptions. The visions are always similar to a dream, in the sense that it's hard to remember the details once they're over, and right now I can't decide what made me think it was the Titanic. Jack seems to be evaluating my words, but then he turns to look again into the empty dining room. After a minute he says, I figured a private island would be the perfect place to escape this newfound talent of yours. Turning toward me and lowering his voice needlessly, he adds, Anyway, I thought it only happened when you touch someone directly. Yeah, at first, but lately it's been happening with metal objects. We both look down at the shiny doorknob. But I thought you said the metal held lingering energy, so that would mean someone had to have touched that doorknob recently, right? He looks around doubtfully. Look, I don't know the exact expiration date of the energy on the knob. I'm just telling you what I saw. Annoyed now and wishing I had kept the image to myself, I stomp through the sand back to the table, and am not yet seated when a peal of laughter cuts through the silence almost like a siren. We both notice it seems to be coming from right around the corner. Guess we're not alone. Jack moves down the porch and motions for me to follow. On the other side of the restaurant, we find an outdoor bar under a white canvas canopy. Several mahogany bar stools with cushioned seats are not yet occupied. The laughter is coming from the only patron seated here, a woman perched on the edge of her stool, leaning toward the bartender, a dark-haired fellow in a crisp white shirt and black vest. His customer flips over an empty shot glass with a delicate hand clad in a lace glove and places it on the bar in front of her. She is wearing a dress of eggplant satin with a plunging back and a long strand of black pearls that gleam against her alabaster skin. Her skin is so white that I can't imagine what she's doing in this sunny paradise. Definitely the kind of woman who has to wear a big hat to the beach, I decide. The woman turns slowly toward us on her stool. She has a Cupid doll face with bright red lips and a colorful scarf tied artfully around her head. Its long material is knotted under her left ear, and she wears gold hoop earrings and large round sunglasses. I feel underdressed with my casual sundress and curse myself for not breaking out one of my fancy new outfits for our first dinner. You must be Gwen and Jack, the bartender calls out, welcoming us with a smile. My earrings jingle softly in response. The bartender wears a name tag that says Roscoe, and sunglasses cover his eyes. Jack walks over and reaches across the bar to shake his hand, while I smile politely at the woman who looks like she just stepped out of an old Hollywood magazine. "Where are you two from?" I can sense her looking me up and down behind her dark Jackie O glasses. Again, my earrings jingle under her scrutiny, and I make a point of trying to keep my head still. "New York." I shift uncomfortably from one foot to the other, self-conscious under her gaze. "Where is everyone?" I direct my question at Roscoe. "There was a big wedding originally scheduled this week. The heiress to the Jazeera dynasty." He runs a rag inside a wine glass and holds it up to the light. "Apparently the bride got cold feet and called the whole thing off." The woman kicks back another shot and slams the glass down on the bar. Dirty bastard was probably only after her money. Roscoe dutifully fills another glass with a golden liquid, and I try to read the label on the bottle. Some kind of tequila. The lady is accumulating shot glasses in a U-shaped formation on the bar in front of her, and I assume she's trying to complete the circle. Roscoe points toward the trees with the bottle. "All the bungalows were originally booked for the wedding guests, but with the last-minute cancellation, the island is pretty much deserted this week. We've got the whole place to ourselves," the woman sings out loud to no one in particular. "So staff got cut way down." "Doesn't the staff live here on the island?" Jack wonders aloud. "Nah," Roscoe shrugs. "We come back and forth by water taxi. Do most of our work behind the scenes." He pulls a wine list from under the bar and hands it to Jack. "Your table has been set up with the welcome buffet. All you need to do is select a wine." We settle on a bottle of Pinot Noir, but all the while I am anxious to get back to the table and touch the back of Jack's shirt to signal that we should sit. We make our way around the porch and cross the beach to our table, where Jack pulls out my chair for me. Several large platters covered with shiny domes greet us, and we lift each one and ooh and ah our way through scalloped potatoes, creamed spinach, and antipasta with cheese, olives, and roasted vegetables. A wedge of baked brie, sprinkled with caramelized almonds, sits on a platter ringed by thinly sliced apples, and there is a heaping bowl of spinach salad sprinkled with gorgonzola cheese. Meanwhile, Roscoe appears silently beside Jack, expertly uncorks the wine, and allows us to sample it before pouring. Then he places a small gold bell on the table for us to ring if we need anything, after which he disappears into the shadows gathering around the restaurant. As the sun slips into the water, darkness falls over the beach, and we consume our food, both of us realizing the extent of our long-denied hunger. Finally full, I cradle my wine glass and lean back in the chair, gazing out at the ocean. As my eyes adjust to the darkness, I detect movement in the water, like stones being skimmed or lily pads quickly bubbling across the surface. What the hell is that? What? Where? Jack twists around in his chair. Over there, swimming toward us, I point. I don't see anything. Sitting forward in my chair, I peer into the blackness, tempted to ring the bell for Roscoe. Cutting through the water in a swift approach are several brown shapes. Right there, like a bunch of animals of some kind, maybe dogs? You see a pack of dogs swimming toward us? Okay, you are officially cut off. Jack reaches for my wine glass. No, seriously, right there. Don't you see their heads in the water? Those aren't dogs. They look like deer. Deer can't swim. Jack laughs. Of course they can. Where did you hear that? I snatch my glass back and then look again at the water. Oh my God, they are deer. We watch as the animals approach the shoreline and one by one gracefully step up onto the beach. They shake the seawater from their fur and move around the beach, their long legs taking purposeful strides as if acclimating themselves to walking on land again. Jack and I are struck by the beauty of their coats, still wet and glistening in the light cast by the tiki torches. Most are brown, but two are almond-colored, one is auburn, and one is black as ink. As the deer pass by close to the table, their faces flash in the candlelight with round, expressive eyes and small heads, but each face is slightly different. There are 12 in all. The two largest males stand protectively around the black doe in the center. Each male in the herd has a set of tall, spiked antlers that arc up toward the dark sky. I'm just going to stop there, but that's just when we first see the deer, so just a little piece. Thank you. So what questions do you have for me? Yes. Oh.
But I'm curious about the cover art and as a self-published author, how that came about.
That's an excellent question. The question is about the cover art and where that came from. So in the self-publishing process, you can choose to use a stock photo, and you have a whole library of stock photos. But the risk is that somebody else's book might have the same photo as your book. So I did invest in a graphic artist to develop the imagery for the cover art, and that was something I did invest in. I found her through someone at work, and it was someone's cousin who lives down in Texas, someone I've never met before, and we communicated on the phone and through email. I sent her a few pieces of the book and gave her some ideas, and I had very clear imagery of what I wanted it to look like, and we would go back and forth a little bit, but it's actually a painting. So I have a painting that I have on my mantle, but it's also a high-resolution JPEG that I can use on my website and on marketing material. And I did decide to invest in that. That was important to me, and that is something at the very end that people say, I'm not going to spend the money on it, but the cover of your book is sometimes the first thing that people see. So I was very happy with the outcome of the book. That's a great question, the cover art. Other questions? Yes.
Is it appropriate for young adults?
That's a good question. Is it appropriate for young adults? Some people do think it's got a young adult sort of feel or vibe to it. She is a 40-year-old woman, so I don't think it was necessarily geared towards young adults, but it's not dirty, it's not violent. I mean, it is something my niece read. She's 14 years old. I do have an audience from 14 is probably the youngest, 13 or 14, to my mother-in-law who's about 75. So it does have a wide range. So it's not necessarily geared toward young adults, but yes, it would be appropriate to give to your nieces and nephews. Nephews, not so much. That's another question, too, of boys or girls. I do feel like girls probably relate to it a little bit more, although I do have some male fans. But that's a good question, too.
And what other books would you, if someone read a certain book, would, like if you went to Amazon and you like this, and what other books would they say you might want to read?
Interesting. Yes. In the fantasy genre, I think right now the biggest competitor is like Game of Thrones. It's been compared to Harry Potter, although I think that it's again, Harry Potter geared towards a young boy. But I think sometimes in the fantasy genre, it's geared towards other authors like that. And to me, I would compare it again to more like old school Anne Rice. Charlene Harris is another one who writes Sookie Stackhouse, the Southern Vampire series. True Blood was based on the series, but the series of books were very different than the series. I would say Charlene Harris as well. It would be sort of that. It's written in the first person, which I like books if you can get into that because you sort of spend a lot of time with the person. So Charlene Harris and her Sookie Stackhouse books I think would be comparable as well because she's a waitress and you go to work with her and you hang out with her and then a vampire shows up in the bar. So that's sort of urban fantasy where you take elements of fantasy and then drop it into a real life setting that you might recognize. It's not dragons and castles and knights. It's actually an island and something like a vacation spot that you might stumble upon. Good questions. Yes?
Do you want to talk a little bit about your writing routine and how you fit it in when you work?
Yes. My writing process. Yes, to write, I'm not a fast writer, and I don't like the pressure of a deadline either. That's why 3.5 years is not necessarily a quick turnaround. Yes, I do have a full-time job, and I do work, so I do a lot of writing on weekends and on vacations. I like to have a long period of time, like a 2-week vacation is a really nice time for me to sort of just get up. I like to work out, make a pot of tea, and I do like to do my writing in the morning. As the day goes on, if I force myself to keep writing for 8 or 10 hours, it's not as good as when I'm writing in the morning. So early in the morning or late at night, I'll say too. Sometimes during the summer, I'll like to lay out in the sun all day and then maybe stay up all night. But I need chunks of time, and not only time, but you need the time and the inspiration at the same moment. So sometimes I'll take off 2 weeks and say, I'm going to write for these 2 weeks, but I'm not motivated to write at all. So it really is hit or miss. And for me, that was challenging too, as I couldn't imagine being a writer where you had a deadline and you had to come up with something by this date. And that's, again, the self-publishing process is I make my own deadlines. So I am sort of slow, but I would say more morning and having focused time. I can't come home from work and sit down and write. My head is still in work. And having people around also is distracting for me, that I do like to be alone when I write. These are good questions.
Did any of
Yes, did it come out of dreams? I read somewhere that Avatar was a dream, that it was this guy had a dream, and that's where a lot of the imagery came from. I do have very vivid dreams, and yes, a lot of the dream sequences did come from ideas or snippets of dreams. There's a part too where the deer are running on the beach at sunset, and that was a dream that I had. So a lot of the imagery does come from that, and I do have very wild dreams. So yeah, a lot of it did come from that. Other questions? Yes.
I heard a rumor you were thinking of doing an audiobook, and I wanted to know how it was going.
What's the status of the audiobook? So, yes, and you just heard me reading very slowly and stopping for periods. I am recording an audiobook read to you by the author. I'm using software called Audacity, which you can record yourself. So I sit with my headset and I read the book. And I read 9 out of the 10 chapters into my computer. And then I started listening to them back, and I could hear birds chirping and dogs barking. And there's all sorts of background noise, so I'm re-recording certain sections. And as I mentioned, I'm not fast. I am sort of slow, and I'm sort of a perfectionist and driving myself crazy. I did want to have something ready for this event, but I would say certainly by the end of the summer I should have something. And I'm thinking it's going to just be available as a download because it is so long. I've also found that each chapter takes me about an hour to read it, and it's like 500 megs. It's huge. So to create CDs, you'd have to have like 10 CDs, and who does that anymore? So I'm thinking it's going to be a nice download, and hopefully by the end of the summer. Yes, an audiobook. Are you an audiobook listener? Do you like your audiobooks?
My mom's a narrator.
Ah.
And she has a home studio.
Yes.
So, and she's just started that. So I was wondering sort of what it felt like to be reading your book out loud. And different from writing, because you've been writing for so long, and you heard people, you put it into that monotone system.
Yes.
But now you're able to hear it back with the inflection. And I was just wondering what the experience was, because it's so different from writing and reading your work.
It's wild. It's wild to read back my book, and also because I published at the end of 2012, and I haven't really thought of it. Now to read back, I'm like, oh, I like this part, or why did I use the word facetiously? There's like certain words, I'm like, why did I do that? Or even notice that sometimes the toning of my words that I'd use these with the tongue twisters and things. And so that's why I think I have slowed down, because when you do make a mistake, you have to go back to the last silence. And if I'm just, I need to go back. So I think editing my own audio has slowed me down dramatically. And it is wild to read back my own stuff. Also, I've started jotting down ideas for book 2, so it's a really nice review to review book 1, because I did plant those little seeds. I do have an idea for all 3 books, and I couldn't even finish this book. It was supposed to be 9 chapters. In my mind, it was a 3-act play. The first 3 chapters is the beginning, last 3 chapters is the end, and the middle 3 chapters. I couldn't finish it in 9 chapters. I ended up writing a 10th chapter. But now I'm excited to go on and write book 2. As I get towards the end, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to do this. So it's an exciting experience, and hopefully I'll have something by the end of the summer. Yes?
Is there anything that you learned through the process that you want to either repeat or do differently for book 2 or book 3?
Yes, that's a good question. I have to say, at the end of book 1, would I do anything differently in book 2 or book 3? I think that I had problems with my wrist, typing, and it almost dovetails from the other question, is I've been toying with something called Dragon Speak, which is another software where you can speak the book and it types it out for you. And I wonder, too, if the book will come out differently if I'm speaking it than when I'm writing it. So I'd like to try pieces of it in Dragon Speak. And I also think that I would finish more of the book before I started sharing it with people. Because in the beginning, I would write a chapter, and I'd share it with a bunch of people, and I'd start editing that chapter, and I'd really like to get the whole thought out before I started sharing it. I think I would wait until I got to that point before I shared it. And I would like to do it a little faster and not drive myself so crazy with, is it large, is it giant, is it massive? Which word do I want to use? Not being so nitpicky. I think I would like to try being a little bit different with. Yeah, good questions. Yes. Did the editing process change the narrative and change the text? I had a false start with an editor. At first, I tried to find a freelance editor. I worked with a few different editors. And in the first 3 chapters, I worked with someone who dramatically, I think, changed my voice and changed my wording and would cross out huge chunks of it and rewrite paragraphs herself, and it was almost like she was a ghostwriter, and that really wasn't what I was looking for. So I think in the beginning, in the first 3 chapters, even now when I read it back in the audiobook, I'm like, that doesn't sound like me right there. But then later when I did find the editor process and the editorial service, I found that worked much better. So I think it's hit or miss. It's kind of like dating. You have to kiss a few frogs to find your prince, but you do need to find an editor that is not going to change your words or not change your story, and that kind of understands where it's going. The editor, too, the freelance editor, wasn't interested in reading the whole thing. She was looking at each chapter, and the first 3 chapters, you have no idea what chapter 10 is going to look like. And so, yeah, I think in the beginning I did have an editor that was dramatically changing my voice, but at the end I've changed a lot of things back, and I've found earlier drafts, too, that have changed it back. They shouldn't really change, like I said, your voice or your theme. They should just enhance it and really make it better. But yeah, no, that's a good question. That is, that's a fear, too, of going with a publisher or being commercial where someone would dramatically try to change the tone. These are great questions.
Michele,
Yes.
How did you continue to keep your focus and still be creative over a 3-year period? I mean, I'm not focused. So if I can't get it after a day or 2, I'm ready to move on to something else.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So how did I stay focused for 3.5 years on this? I have to tell you, the creative part in me is just something. I mean, I'm 44 now. For 44 years, I feel like I've always needed something creative. So whether I was doing community theater, or whether I was, singing in a band, or I've always needed some kind of creative outlet. This was my creative outlet. So I would turn to this book, whenever I needed. It's escapism. I developed this world that I loved to be in. It was this imaginary world that I'd like to play in. So I hope that it's a book that you like to be in, but how did I keep that energy or that momentum is because I wrote a world that I liked to visit every day and that I liked to play in. So it inspired me to really make something that I would want to visit and want to spend time with. I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with this text, right? So it had to be something that stimulated me. But I feel like I always need something. I mean, now that the book is over, I'm doing the audiobook, and then the audiobook's over, I need the second book. I think I always need something. So it was my thing. But that's a good question. Is it something you're born with or something you can force yourself to do? If you have a 2-day attention span, probably it's not your thing. Yeah, there's something, yes. Any other questions?
What about your support structure?
What is my support structure like? Poor Jack. I have a very, very supportive husband who is in the book as well, and he's always said that if the book takes off, he's going to write a book from Jack's perspective because it's really not fair. My husband is very, very supportive of me, and like I said, spending hundreds of hours and spending time alone, or if I'm not alone, if he's there but he's on his iPad, just playing, it's that sort of environment that I need to write in that he does offer me, and that he has read parts of it and has helped me develop it. There was a scene where Jack hid something in the bungalow, and at first I had him hide it in the floorboards, and he pulls up the floorboard, and he's like, Michele, I'm not pulling up a floorboard in a vacation spot. I'd put it in the air conditioning vent, and I was like, oh, that's much better. So he also helps inspire certain ideas, and the psychic that I visited just recently said, I need to listen to Jack more. She said, does he read your work? And I said, yes, and she said, you need to listen more. I'm like, oh. Yes, I have a very, very strong support system. Okay, yes, so now we go to our signing of the book section of the of the program. Thank you very much.